Hello and welcome back to the Bitcoin with Jake show. So tonight I have my friend Richard James on the line. Richard, thank you very much for joining.
Hi, Jake. Thanks for having me.
No, pleasure. So as I touched on just before we click record, I'm very keen to learn about yourself, learn about the journey that you've been on to get to today. But before we dig into all those details, could you ask or could you answer for me, what are you involved in at the moment, like your projects? Perhaps you have a day job, and just a brief introduction as to what Richard James is all about.
Yeah, so my day job at the moment, I'm working on a business. I suppose you'd call it a startup, although I'm not really in that world. It's sort of it's a food production business. Actually, I've in years gone by, I've been in the travel industry and had my own business, but that sort of took a bit of a blow a couple of years ago with COVID and no more internet, all the shutdowns, and we couldn't do any traveling, which we relied on in our business. So we sort of had to kind of get a bit creative and sort of change the direction of the business, which we've been able to do. We were a tour operating company, and we did a lot of trekking, hiking, stuff like that. And we had one small part of the business which we would make our own food for these trips we would do, because we'd go to remote places where often we couldn't reliably source local food, or we just found it was better to send our own stuff. And so we started making that here in Australia, and then really just to supply ourselves. But then when we stopped being able to travel, we thought maybe there was an opportunity to turn that into a product that we could sell to other people. So we've sort of been working on that. I've always been lucky, or at least I've always wanted to work towards a situation where I can kind of set my own schedule and be able to be my own boss. I work from home. I've always done that, always wanted to do that. And it's interesting. It's sort of like this double-edged sword, in that I've got the freedom to do what I want, but sometimes you can get a bit lost. You've got to be self-disciplined to be able to stay on track in that kind of scenario. And then I've enjoyed the freedom of always trying to run my own businesses, but sometimes we've gone through tough periods. Now we're going through a difficult period, and there's always that uncertainty. You don't have the stability of a normal job where you've got a paycheck coming in week after week. So the good thing about that is that it gives me time to focus on other things if and when I want to put my focus there, which is why I've been able to devote some of my time to Bitcoin and economics and some of the themes around it.
Wow. I love how but all sorts of different types of characters get drawn into the Bitcoin space, and we'll get into your interest in Bitcoin, and I'm sure many people listening in will know that you're the creator of some great Bitcoin films. But before we get there, so can you talk to me a bit about the actual food product that you're creating? So I'm assuming it's a product for harsh climates, essentially. So you were running your tours and people were up mountains or in glaciers or I don't even know where. So yeah, I'd love to learn a bit more about that.
So it's called On Track Meals is the name of the business. You can look it up and look the product up on our website. So it's a process called retort packaging. So it basically, you cook a meal, whether it's for example, it might be a spaghetti bolognese, or we've even got a steak, or some other vegetarian stuff. We've got curries, stews, things like that. You cook it sort of as normal, but then put it in a certain type of pouch, which is, it can either be aluminium or plastic, a certain kind of strong plastic, and sealed in a very specific way, and put in this machine called a retort machine, which cooks at at a certain temperature and pressure in combination, which basically then means that it's shelf stable when it comes out the other end. So it doesn't need to go into a fridge after that. So you can throw it in a pack and take it hiking in a jungle or something. And it's perfectly good. It can stay for up to 3 years. But because of that pouch and the way it's cooked, it's quite like, it's not like tinned food where you taste like it's just been blasted all the nutrients out of it. It's actually, it means that you can maintain a pretty good tasting product. And so we used to do this trek called the Kokoda Track, which is up in Papua New Guinea. It's quite I suppose you'd say for Australians, it's one of those things that, a lot of Australians have a desire to go and do this trek. It's got a reputation as being very challenging, but you go through these battlefields from the Second World War and where the Australians fought the Japanese, and some of the stories of what happened up there during the war are quite incredible. And so, in my earlier years, before I sort of started my own business doing this, I would work as a tour guide up there. So you'd take groups up there, and you'd sometimes be up there for weeks on end. And Papua New Guinea is a pretty, it's a pretty difficult place. And we would eat these dehydrated rations, which is the stuff you see in any camping store here. If you walk into the store and buy something, it's like, this dehydrated packet that you've got to add boiling water to. And I just got to a point where I just couldn't. I was like, I don't care what it takes. I'm never touching one of these again. So the whole business grew out of this desire to find a better alternative to the kind of food we'd be served up there.
Wow. I love entrepreneurship, and it's the lifeblood of every economy, right? It's people that see problems and they pour their life energy force into solving it, right? It's some people are built like that. They go, this problem's so annoying to me, I have to do something about it. And in many ways, that's what's so interesting about Bitcoin, because it solves different problems for different people, and it just depends what kind of character turns up. How cool. Wow. Yeah, the process of seeing opportunities and then actually actioning them is very difficult, frankly. How's the business going as it stands? You guys are making some sales, and everything's looking healthy for the future?
Yes, it's sort of like it was hard to have to start again, because we'd spent 10 years building up a travel business.
Wow.
To a certain size, and then that basically just got decimated overnight. So it was starting
that was
from
like
scratch again.
March 2020 lockdown.
Exactly. We had a whole season that, that's sort of the start of our busy season, because it's through the sort of autumn and winter that people
and Richard,
start traveling.
So in the average kind of holiday season starting March, when does the season finish? How many tours were you running during that time?
I think we had the season up in Papua New Guinea, runs from sort of April through till October, November.
Wow.
And we were doing that, and then in the summertime we'd do trips to Nepal and to Africa, and also to around Australia as well, to Tasmania. I think we had 40 or 50 trips scheduled to run in 2020, and they all just, well, it's amazing how quickly it happened. How I remember having a conversation with my colleagues even in possibly February, and when the first headlines were starting to hit about this thing, and I remember saying, "Oh, it's interesting that no one's contacted us about this yet. None of our clients have come in with any concerns." Yep. And then everyone was saying, "Oh, it's not going to be a big deal. It'll blow over." And then I think within a matter of weeks, everything had been cancelled, and we sort of spent the entire year just giving people money back, basically. So
that must have been very, very challenging.
It was sort of, it was like I would often, over the years, worry about what might go wrong in the business, and I thought it might be something in Papua New Guinea where something would go wrong on a specific trip, or something would change in the political situation up there that would mean we couldn't couldn't do our work.
Mm.
And, you know, that I always identified that as the main threat to the business. But you couldn't, you know, I just couldn't have even imagined anything like this. You know, when you're dreaming up your worst case scenario, disaster scenario for the business, you couldn't have even imagined this. So it's interesting to have now been through that and come out the other side. I think the thing we're realizing is that this new business is actually a better business and a better industry to be in and a better opportunity. I think the travel, although we all came together to, you know, for a love of the adventure and the lifestyle that we got from that business, it's a tough business to run. You know, these operations in third world countries, it's not very scalable. You know, it would be just a lot of work to, you know, to bring the next group of clients in. And whereas, you know, with this new business, it's we can see a path to growing bigger with the same size team without necessarily needing to put in as much effort. So I think, you know, if we, I think it's you know, I may look back on it as one of those things where it was a blessing in disguise, where we never would have investigated this new opportunity had it not been for what we went through in 2020.
And so, Richard, off the top of my head, I'm just imagining, you know, the travel business, you're trying to get probably relatively wealthy people to a specific location, a specific time, somewhere in the world. You have to get them all there. You then have to organize everything for them. It requires a lot of labor on your own behalf. Lots of shit can go wrong, probably highly stressful, like 40 or 50 trips you mentioned that got canceled. I mean, that's a hell of a lot of back end work to pull off that, let's say, product, versus what you've essentially described, which is a kind of a ready meal kit that's a superior product to what was on the market before, which I imagine is not necessarily cheap to produce, but at least has a relatively fixed cost. It's done through a supply chain that you can kind of predict more easily than emotional humans, right? You know, are they going to be there on the 1st of April for their trip, and are they going to fully pay for the whole, you know, you just don't know, right? Gosh, how interesting. And to me, what's cool about that is adversity, right? You're challenged, like, fuck, 40 or 50 trips gone, revenue gone. In fact, I'm going to have to empty my company coffers to pay people back in what is an ethical thing to do at this stage. God knows what insurance you may or may not have had in place, but the kind of the black swan moment arrived. And, you know, there's a lot of people in the travel industry that would be thinking the same thing as yourself. Can you talk a bit about, like,
the business was already on a Bitcoin standard at that point, so that
okay, well, that helps. That helps, I'm sure.
A bit of a buffer, whereas, you know, a lot of the other businesses
wouldn't be,
or specifically in that
absolutely
industry
not.
or anyone in travel, just you know, everyone just got smashed.
What?
So I think I think I have to give us credit for finding that new opportunity amongst adversity. But certainly having that Bitcoin there and knowing that was there as a backup, you know, that helped as well.
Well, I mean, Richard, let's dive into that for sure, because there won't be many small businesses out there that have Bitcoin on the balance sheet. So can you explain to me the day that happened as a business owner? Like, how did you let's say, what problem was Bitcoin solving for you as a small business, and how has your business benefited as a result of, I'm assuming you literally bought Bitcoin with your balance sheet, but yeah, just talk us through how you did it, why you did it, and what that's meant for the business.
Well, I'd been on the sort of Bitcoin journey myself in a couple of years prior to that. And
actually, Richard, so let me jump in. Let's go right back to there. And so, okay, so you've basically been an entrepreneur for, you know, as long as you can remember, running your own business. I love this process of wanting to be your own boss, setting your own schedule. During that time, Bitcoin came along somewhere. Let's jump in at that point, and then we'll reach why your business decided to adopt the Bitcoin standards. So, do you know what I mean? Because we'll take a few steps back.
Yeah, absolutely.
So when did you first get involved with Bitcoin, and what was that process like?
It wasn't that long ago. It was 2019 was when I really got interested in Bitcoin, or learned enough about it to take an interest. But I'd sort of, in the years leading up to that, I think I'd been sort of going down these rabbit holes that were relevant in a way that when I finally learned about Bitcoin, I knew almost instantly that it was the answer to a lot of these problems.
Okay.
So those being things like Austrian economics and gold. I was interested in gold and sound money and what makes a good money. And it's funny, I think back to these conversations I would have with my father, because we both had to have a sort of an interest in economics, and we both studied economics at the same institution, sort of one generation after the other at Sydney University, although he was probably a better student than I was. I didn't actually make it through the entire economics course. I just couldn't put up with it. But and he was probably the one that sort of started me on this path, in that he came to me one day and he said, I just had this conversation with my accountant, and I don't think he understands that the central bank can just create money out of nothing. And that was kind of his, like, my dad's sort of thing, was that no one actually understood the fact that the system worked this way. Not even looking at it in a sense of is it good or bad, just that even people who are very high up in the system itself don't actually have an understanding of how it works. And I think we sometimes do take it for granted, in that those of us who have been interested in Bitcoin for a long time, kind of, you don't realize how far down the path you've gone of understanding how the monetary system works. And so for someone to even get their head around that first step of how the central bank controls the financial system, and the fact that they can, inverted commas, create money from nothing, is kind of a big jump. And so he and I would kind of have these
Richard,
discussions.
Roughly, sorry for jumping in. So roughly, can you remember when it was that your father made that comment to you about his accountant?
This is probably 2016 or 17, something like that.
Yep.
And so I also remember a conversation with him where I said something. It was almost a throwaway line about government debt, and saying that, eventually, it's irresponsible for for the government to go into all this debt, and they should be trying to run a balanced budget or something like that, was what I said, from a point of not really understanding exactly what I was talking about. But my dad had a go at me and said, no, like that, I'm sick of hearing this from people. The government doesn't need to run a balanced budget because it's got the ability to create money.
Wow.
So
he was all over it. Yeah.
Yeah. And so what's interesting is when you reflect on what he's saying, it's almost like an MMT type
critique
point of view, where he's saying that there's no problem with the central bank creating money. There's nothing wrong with that, and they can do that indefinitely. And he is also, I think, coming from the point of view of a trust in the system, that the system is designed in a certain way for the right reasons, and that the central and one of the tenets of that is that the central bank is an independent institution, separate from the government itself, with certain policy goals that are apolitical and are in the best interests of the country. Whereas I would certainly now take a much more skeptical kind of approach and say that the central bank is sort of like another arm of the state, and that it's not, its main role is kind of to finance government, the growth of government, rather than anything else. And so He I think has to give him credit, has kind of come around to my point of view as the years have gone on. But I certainly have to sort of, I guess, credit him with getting me interested in all these things. And so, but I was pondering that conversation and the nature of government debt, and is government debt the same as me having a debt as in a household where I've got to make sure that my expenditures don't exceed my income. And so I sort of started learning more about that and reflecting on my experience of studying economics, both at school and at university, where I think there was so many things that were omitted and not explained properly, and with the wrong assumptions attached to them. And it was sort of like going back and starting again and really trying to understand this stuff properly. And that led me to some information about it. Somehow I got to the doorstep of Austrian economics. So I was reading, I read Henry Hazlitt's book, Economics in One Lesson. Then I started reading books by James Rickards, who's obviously, you wouldn't call him an Austrian economics, but he, has a critique of the modern financial system and how fragile it is. And he's a big advocate for gold, and takes you a fair way down the path of why gold's important and why a financial system based on gold, the advantages that may have. And there certainly are a lot of advantages if you've never heard of Bitcoin. A gold-based system seems like the best system. And so, I was also at a point in life where I was interested in, for the first time, in investing, or at least trying to preserve and grow wealth. And so those two paths kind of went hand in hand. I was interested in Warren Buffett and value investing and Benjamin Graham and that kind of thing. And that led me to, I was a regular listener of the Investors podcast, which is Preston Pish and Stig Brodersen, their podcast. Brilliant. And that's where I really first heard about Bitcoin in any detail. And not long after listening to one or two episodes of them talking about it, I found the Bitcoin Standard and read that. And that's when everything sort of clicked, that this, this system of Bitcoin was designed on a certain set of principles that related to Austrian economics and sound money that solved this problem in a way that even gold hadn't been able to solve. And so that was kind of my way into it. And then what's interesting is that from there, I sort of went on another rabbit hole, which was libertarianism and anarcho-capitalism and sort of this political philosophy that underpinned the work of the cypherpunks. And that's been a really important thing for me. And I think something that's, from my point of view, has been equally enlightening and important as Bitcoin itself.
What a journey, Richard. It's interesting in that now I think this is the fourth interview I've done as part of my new podcast. And the journey that everyone takes is different. Like, no doubt it's different. But then there are similarities. And the Investors podcast that you mentioned, and Preston Pish and their show was, mentioned by another guest. And that was the journey they took, was also that value investing lens, looking to preserve wealth. And then they came across that podcast, and that podcast taught them about Bitcoin. And then they go, well, hang on, none of the calculations I'm doing from a value investor perspective make any sense, because all of these equities are so overpriced. Like, how can you actually find anything to invest in? And yeah, it strikes me as there's going to be so many different angles that people bring to the table, but you're the first person who's mentioned a parent being really influential in their thinking. And it doesn't really matter if your father was, in favor of central banking and modern monetary theory. it's the questioning that's been created and instilled at that point. Like, is this the right way to do things? And should we be doing this? And look at that journey that it took you down, right? Had that question or that conversation with his accountant never happened, then maybe you wouldn't be stood here today. Would you say that, drawing strands on all of that, what to you was the most exciting or let's say, enlightening kind of subject that you came across? So at the end there, you touched on the libertarianism and anarcho-capitalism, for example. That's not something that I hear people talk about that much. Can you dive into that a little further and explain what you felt as a result of learning about that?
Well, it's interesting the way the journey started. The journey to Bitcoin started obviously as wanting to find ways to make money, as purely as an investment. And this is probably another common theme that you hear, is that the thing I think that's kept me so interested in Bitcoin over the years and has got me so motivated to be involved in Bitcoin is just the fact that it's a fair system. Like I having come through these years of study, I'm almost now finding myself, there's certain things that I was really sure of after having studied Bitcoin and the I guess economics around it for maybe 6 months. I was so sure of certain things, and now actually perhaps it's coming full circle where I sort of am now starting to question some things that I thought were certain. But the one thing I am sure of is that I think Bitcoin is a fair system, and I think the world would be a better place if we adopted Bitcoin as a monetary system. And so, because for the simple fact that the same rules apply to everyone, it doesn't matter who you are, the rules apply equally. And that got me thinking about politics for the first time really in my life. Up till recently, it's not something that had ever interested me. But the libertarian system is basically just the person who's influenced me most in that regard is Murray Rothbard. He's an Austrian economist, but he's also developed this ethical system, and it's built on the system called praxeology, which was developed by Ludwig von Mises, which is sort of like just a study of human action, and it takes some really basic first principles about the nature of humans and how they act, and the fact that they use means to achieve ends. And he derives an ethical system sort of based on some of these first principles. And the reason that I find it appealing is that it's a system of rules that can apply to any person in any situation, across all time and space. There's no caveats, there's no privilege, there's no in-group and out-group, there's no ruling class or underclass. And even a system like democracy, which is has a lot to be said for it, and I'm very hesitant to posit a better alternative to democracy. It's only that I notice problems with democratic systems, and I think some of the problems of the modern world and where we found ourselves in 2022 can be traced back to flaws in the democratic system. And so I've become fascinated with this idea of whether you could organize a society based on some of these anarchic principles, where you don't have to instill a state with the monopoly on violence and all the problems that grow out of that. And it's a philosophy that a lot of the cypherpunks shared, and basically Bitcoin is built on some of these philosophical principles, about the ability through anonymity and through a private telecommunications channel to abstract away the ability for one party to use violence against another, whether that's the government or whether it's a single actor acting violently. So there's certainly some parallels there, but with Bitcoin. So that's been an interesting kind of parallel journey.
And it's funny how, in so many ways, when you are, let's for example just describe going through school and you've got 10 subjects and you sit in a classroom and you're taught whatever the subject might be, and they give you case studies, and the case studies apparently give you context to understand the theory that you're being taught. And I find Bitcoin brings context to basically every single subject I've ever studied in my life. Now, in this case, we're talking about how to build society. It's very philosophical in a sense, but obviously there's a political side to it. And it just is mind-blowing, the kind of concepts that it brings to mind. Like, what does it mean that a state has a monopoly on violence? Like, what does that actually mean? And what are the flaws in a democratic system? These are great questions that frankly don't get asked enough. And this is what I find so exciting about talking to people that are interested in Bitcoin, because we don't have to know the answer, but asking it in the first place is really, really cool. So could we hypothesize for a second? I mean, we see the world around us. We've grown up with it. We're completely conditioned in a sense to think that it's totally normal how we live. And then along comes this nascent technology that might change that. How do you see the future in that sense? Like, what might change around us? Like, can you think of any specific use cases in a sense that you've come across that we might see a different world in a day-to-day life? Or how do you think it's going to evolve over time?
Yeah, it's a good question, and a lot of my thinking along these lines has been influenced by a book called The Sovereign Individual, which
it's awesome. Yeah,
was really pivotal in my sort of journey through this. And that, I suppose, it lays out, it was written well before Bitcoin, but it's kind of eerie how prophetic it was in certain ways,
isn't it?
Predicting how
like spooky
something like Bitcoin
whoa.
would be, how influential that would be. So I'd like to think that the thesis outlined in that book plays out somewhat, which is just that, in a nutshell, the advance of technology is kind of like a bulwark against the expanding power of the state. The state being defined as a monopolist on violence, that is just whatever organization controls, the most guns in a given territory, basically.
Can tax everyone however they want.
Yeah, exactly. And extort resources basically however they want. But in order to do that, they're very much reliant on the physical nature of those resources. So the fact that those resources, be they factories or individual people working and living in a certain space, they need to be able to, that whole system is grounded in meat space, in the physical realm. Whereas with the advance of the information age, assets and value all of a sudden are becoming dematerialized. So that can be as simple as something like a piece of software, which you can't tie that to a physical space and time. It can, it's not material. And then the ultimate form of this expression of value is something like Bitcoin, where you have a money that is not tied to anything physical. And so that basically makes it much more advantageous to defend that. It's really easy to defend that asset. We can defend Bitcoin by keeping a private key, keeping information in our heads. We can move around. We can send that at the speed of light. That's really difficult for an adversary to take over, to control, to tax, to steal. And so the hope is that over time, that the evolution of that phenomenon means that it's more difficult for governments to fund themselves. And basically the 20th century and the way it's basically, it's sort of almost like the story of deficit funding, of governments using inflation to live beyond their means, to fight these crazy world wars, and to create these kind of social welfare states. And I think that maybe this next century, we may at least see a reversal of that. Just if nothing else, seeing the size of government reduce just a little bit. Anything would be better than nothing, but a world where perhaps people are treated, citizens are treated more like clients, where people have a choice, where it's more of a pay for service type model. People have the ability to move around the world. Perhaps people who people in poorer countries who wouldn't have had these kind of opportunities through access to the internet and information technology, perhaps they can develop skills, market themselves, and perhaps join that, sort of join that phenomenon and benefit from that as well. That may be asking too much, because the Sovereign Individual book it talks about how it potentially gets worse before it gets better, and that you may have to be in the real upper echelons of asset owners to be able to take advantage of this phenomenon. But I like to think that certainly with Bitcoin, it gives an equal opportunity to everyone to take part in that.
And the word that I like the most around that kind of equal opportunity thing is the phrase of a meritocracy. And that, you bring to the table what you can create or what you can sell, and you exchange it for a hard money like Bitcoin. And those in society that are the most productive will benefit the best. And that's completely different to the world we live in today, essentially, where someone can just print money out of nowhere. They don't have to do any work. They just print it. It's nuts when you start thinking about it. And just to draw on some of the stuff you're talking about, it's very powerful, that concept of defending wealth. And, let's say over history, I was capable of, beating some people up and stealing their gold. How are you going to steal someone's Bitcoin? Like, if you kill them, you can't just take their Bitcoin, because you won't be able to get in their private wallet, right? So the incentive structure for this monopoly on violence, and therefore the growth of what is now modern government, it's almost completely redundant in the Bitcoin world. And as you already mentioned, the Sovereign Individual basically predicted that this would happen at some point, which it's so spooky to think about. There's so many cool angles we could go down, but what I want to do, Richard, is draw back to the statement you made earlier about your business adopting the Bitcoin standard. So we've covered lots about the journey you've been on, the rabbit holes you went down, why you were there. And I love all of that, because it gives such good context. So then, right, I'm a business owner and I'm going to make a big decision here, which I can pretty much, you'll be the first 1% of business owners globally to have done something like this, more than likely. So what was the problem that your business faced, and how did you go about adopting a Bitcoin standard for it?
Well, I guess there was a problem in that I found that I forget which, maybe if we go back a couple of years, the Australian dollar was going through this sort of long decline and getting weaker and weaker against the US dollar. So we would, we had a lot of expenses denominated in US dollars. So I'd find that we'd draw up a budget to run a trip somewhere, and then 3 or 4 months later, when it came time to actually do the trip, the exchange rate had changed, and all of a sudden our profit margin had evaporated. So that was kind of one example. And I know that that's a simple problem, on a business of any real scale, that's a simple problem to solve with sort of hedging and forward contracts and things like that. But we're a relatively small business, and the expense involved in getting involved in exchange rate markets wasn't really something we'd ever looked at. But probably more than that, it was just the fact that I'd see we would have our operational expenses that would come out of the business day to day, and we had an account for that. But then we would have another account where clients would pay us money, pay a deposit for a trip, and we might not have to run the trip for, say, 6 months or so. And then, but once that time came around, new clients would have paid into the account for a trip, further down the track. So we had this account where there was a a relatively steady balance of money just sort of sitting there in a bank account where it was earning no interest. And we could be relatively sure that, you know, a certain portion of it we wouldn't need to use for up to 12 months. And in certain industries, you know, it's quite normal to say in the insurance industry, like the way Warren Buffett made all his money, you know, that people would pay their insurance premium and then they would take that money and go off and invest that in shares or whatever. And that's how that, knowing that a payout, if it was going to come, would be potentially years down the track. So it was sort of investing that float that would kind of make them all their money. So it was kind of applying a similar principle, which was just to say that if we've got a certain amount of cash sitting around, we'd be better off in
let's buy a
Bitcoin
deflationary asset
than in a dollar bank account. Yeah. And so I put that to the other people involved in the business, and they were open-minded and willing to go along with it. You know, it certainly was a risky thing to do. And I think back to just how sure I was at that stage. I don't know, this is probably 2019, that the price of Bitcoin was going to go up. I mean, I'm glad that it did, because I think if it had have gone the other way, you know, I think it would have just been a matter of waiting it out. But it's nice the fact that, you know, fairly quickly, you know, the timing was good, and so it wasn't like I had to explain, you know, a bad decision. Like, it worked out quite well. So,
Richard, if I could jump in just briefly, so you've kind of slightly already answered it, but how did you actually do this? So for example, you know, one of the major influences in my re-engagement in Bitcoin was watching Michael Saylor buying $450 million worth of Bitcoin without telling anyone, as a stock listed company in the States. So he's got armies of lawyers, armies of accountants, armies of shareholders, all saying that you can't fuck this company up. And he still did it. You know, it's as good a due diligence of it as an asset you could possibly ask for, in my opinion. Are you the sole equity owner in the business that you're part of, and who else was involved? And did you have to go to, say, like a board meeting and pitch for it? And just, I know that MicroStrategy has a playbook somewhere that you can, you know, kind of copy. There probably isn't one for small businesses, which I think would be a really interesting opportunity to explore, is to create like a playbook for a small business to adopt the Bitcoin standard. But yeah, could you just explain a little bit more about how you actually went about that as a small business?
Yeah, with the small business, obviously it's so dependent on the individuals involved and the personalities and the structure, which can vary radically from business to business. I was in this position where I was the not the sole shareholder, but the majority shareholder. So I did have this ability to sort of say, this is what we're going to do, and, you know, that's it to a certain extent. I mean, I wouldn't have gone ahead with it if the others weren't comfortable.
Which, funny enough, I think is very similar to like Saylor has extraordinary control of his company, unlike
he was
most
in a similar situation,
stock-listed
on a very different
CEOs.
scale.
Yeah,
which is why obviously he's been able to do that, and
which is why there aren't many other MicroStrategies
has been able to follow suit. But then, you know, once that we'd had that discussion, everything was very simple. I mean, there's the slightest element of additional complexity in registering a business for a Bitcoin exchange than than an individual. To be honest, the KYC requirements are quite onerous. Like the paperwork is really annoying. And I actually, I think a couple of times I had to give up because I just couldn't. There were possibly some discrepancies in my documentation. It's like, oh, well, your
listen here, Mr.
Securities
James, you
and
can't do this.
Commission registered address doesn't match the address on this bank statement. Oh my gosh! So anyway, that's irrelevant. But yeah, there was no other sort of nothing else to it except from signing up to an exchange and buying the Bitcoin.
Well, Richard, I'd love to congratulate you on your boldness as an entrepreneur in that sense. There'd be many people out there that wouldn't have made that decision, and no, well done. I'm absolutely confident that it's the right one to have made, and the future will be very rosy for any other small business owner that out there that might be listening. You know, there's people out there that have done this, and it's possible. And I think that's really what I'm trying to convey in general from this podcast is there are a lot of people that have spent a lot of time in their lives thinking about how to, you know, build society, run companies, make money, and they're getting involved in Bitcoin. And that's really what brings us all together today. So Richard, to move on a bit, you've made some excellent films. I've watched them all. They're absolutely brilliant. I had the pleasure of meeting you in person at the Bitcoin Bush Bash, and you mentioned you actually went to film school at one point and grew up in Sydney. That's probably a whole nother life. But yeah, let's explore that for a bit. So you went to film school. Did you ever make any other movies? What's film school actually like? What do you learn? And when was the time when you thought, actually, I'm going to sit down and I'm going to make a 30-minute long film about Bitcoin?
Well, going back to when I was still studying, I'd done a commerce degree, which is where I did some of that economics.
Right.
And I was signed up to do an additional. I'd just finished that degree. I think it was 4 years long, because it was combined with liberal studies, and I'd been doing some sort of history and arts type stuff, and I was actually signed up to do an additional year. And it's so long ago, I can't remember what they call it, a master's or an honors year or something like that. And I was going to do it in German, the German language, where I was going to do some kind of literature study of I can't even remember the exact topic.
Really
now.
longing out your student career.
But it's just a symptom of. I mean, that probably would have been interesting enough. I mean, I think there's there's worse things you potentially could be doing. At least in Australia, you're not racking up thousands of dollars of student debt. And I'd been able to get a scholarship to do that, so it wouldn't have been. Financially wouldn't have necessarily been a terrible thing to do, but I just remember, at our long holiday, break here is over the summer, and remember, I was traveling at the time, and just thinking, oh God, I don't think I can go back and do this. I need to do something else. And so, sort of made this spur of the moment decision. I'd been into photography, in the years leading up to that. And so kind of just made this spur of the moment decision that I wasn't going to go back to studying at university. I was going to go to film school instead. And I sort of hadn't really thought more about it than that. And so I came back to Sydney and enrolled in this film school, which I'm not sure if it still exists anymore, but it was quite a new school. It was only opened a few years before I joined there, and so I went there, and it was a 2-year course in studying film directing and screenwriting and film producing and all these things. And that was, I don't know that it was the wrong thing to do, but I wasn't particularly inspired there. I just think that I had some good teachers, but the group of people I was with just wasn't. I wasn't finding myself with a group of people that were really inspiring, and I thought we're going to go off and achieve amazing things. And I wasn't. And I was probably the same, to be honest. But it just wasn't. Just for whatever reason, it didn't click, the atmosphere there. And the thing I realized, I'd got 6 months into this course, and I learned some quite useful stuff. Like, that's actually where I learned to use video editing software. That was probably the most useful thing. And also how to use cameras and things like that. I realized in hindsight, I would have been better off with a more technical course. There was also a directors of photography course where it was more technical. And I think that could have been better. But I think I realized the problem was, and you hit the nail on the head, which was that I just spent too many years in institutions. And I was like, I'm sick of sort of getting up and going to class every morning and getting set an assignment. Maybe it's an interesting assignment where I'm actually making a film, but it's still an assignment that some professor, teacher has set me that has completely zero relevance to the real world, and whether I succeed or fail at this thing I've been told to do just is completely irrelevant. And I think I was craving some sort of real world validation. I think I had this realization that I needed to just get out there and do something on my own terms and see what happens. So I sort of dropped out of the film school, which I think was the right thing to do. And my brother had just recently got out of the army. And so the two of us got together, and we'd always had this passion for surfing. We grew up in Sydney near the beach. And so we came up with this crazy idea to go to Africa. And we spent a year traveling through Africa surfing. We made a documentary, sort of a surf film about our trip. And that was fantastic. That was one of those experiences that real formative, life-changing, experience that I still look back on so fondly.
And how old were you and your brother at the time?
We were in our early 20s,
Awesome.
23, something like that.
Yeah.
That was great. And, I spent a few years doing that. And that was a real DIY sort of project, in that we filmed that ourselves. I just did all the editing at home, put this film together, and really had no idea. We're also not, and it was a surf film. Like most of the film is taken up with us surfing, but we're not professional surfers. So I had a lot of anxiety and sort of, I was self-conscious as to whether anyone would actually be interested to watch this thing. But it was incredibly well received. And I think just the fact that we'd sort of put our heart and soul into this project for a year, and we'd really gone through some shit to sort of go on this journey and make this film. And that, I think, really shone through in the project, like that you couldn't sort of fake what we'd been through to make this. And people responded to that. And so yeah, that did really well in that we were able to go to a lot of film festivals, and we got distribution for the film. And so that was quite a successful project on the scale that it was made for. And so I did a few more projects along those lines. We did an interesting one where we went to Afghanistan and went snowboarding, while the war was going on there, and then another one where we went to and got a plane to drop us on a glacier in Alaska, and we lived out and camped out on the ice on this glacier for a month, skiing and exploring, and made a film about that. So yeah, I was making these films, these sort of adventure, travel, sports kind of documentaries, and that was fantastic and great fun and a good lifestyle. But I suppose it wasn't something you could really make a living out of. We were able to sort of drum up enough money through sponsorship and recoup through selling the films for them to pay for themselves, probably, but not to really earn a good living. And I saw friends who really were dedicated to that industry going on to work in more corporate settings, whether it's in advertising or maybe trying to break into bigger, working on bigger film projects, professional film sets and things like that, which none of that stuff really appealed to me, because I found the actual process of being out in the field with a camera or on a film set to be quite a stressful one. Like, I'm not really a great team player. Like I'm sort of quite, I seem to prefer working as an individual on my own. And so I find that, the stress of a big film set to be full on, it was always worth it if I had a vision for a certain project to go through that to get to the end. But, if I was going to work in that field, I wanted it to really be on my own terms. And at the same time, this idea for a travel business had kind of come up, and that I sort of took that opportunity just because it seemed like a better opportunity to make a living. I'd sort of went in that direction and had a family, and kind of stopped stopped really doing any filmmaking work. I was also interested in writing because that was something that had always interested me. So I also, in conjunction with the work I was doing on the Kokoda track, I wrote a book about military history, which is about a lot of the soldiers who fought in Papua New Guinea had also, in the previous years of the war, fought in the Middle East, in Syria and Lebanon, in this really interesting campaign where the Australians were fighting against the French, who were sort of supposed to be on the Allied side. But it was almost like a French civil war going on in the Syria and Lebanon colonies that the Australians got caught up in, which I found fascinating. And so I wrote a book about that. And that was another really interesting experience, which took quite a few years. And so, but the filmmaking had fallen by the wayside really until 2020, when all of a sudden I found myself at home, locked down, not being able to travel, not having that much to do, and was, bursting at the seams with enthusiasm for Bitcoin, and looking for a way to not, I wouldn't say to contribute, because I've never felt that I've really, I've got this, these ideas to contribute to the Bitcoin space. It's more just that, when you're so fascinated by something, you just want to work, or you want to devote yourself and your energy to that subject. And if someone can take something away from your work, then that's great. But my initial attempts to sort of work it was almost like trying to get my own thoughts straight about, I was learning all this stuff about Bitcoin, and I wanted to sort of somehow regurgitate it in a way that made it sure that I understood what I was talking about. And I was trying to write in the first instance, but found that I couldn't seem to string together a really coherent idea. And there was already a lot of good writing around at that point on the subject of Bitcoin. And so I thought, I don't know what the spark was, but I just remember thinking, look, there's hardly any, because I'd searched YouTube and searched the internet for documentaries about Bitcoin, and specifically Bitcoin, whereas all the stuff that's out there is sort of crypto, this, and I didn't feel like there was any video content that really captured that spirit of Bitcoin at that time, where, this narrative, it was not that long after the Bitcoin standard had been released, and this narrative was crystallizing about the value of Bitcoin and what it really represented, which was this incorruptible sound money. And to understand Bitcoin was to really understand the nature of money and what makes a good money. And so I just started, I thought, maybe I could, make a video, but I obviously couldn't go anywhere. And so it was the project, which was
a video
called
of your
Hard
house
Money.
and your kids and your wife. Like, there's not much else you can do in a lockdown.
And that suited me fine, because I didn't want the stress or the hassle or the expense of traveling to make a film. And so, I just thought there was so much content being made and released onto the internet that surely there was a way to put it all together in a format that you weren't kind of doubling over this ground that had already been done. Like with all the podcasts that I was listening to, they were sort of the inspiration for the project, piecing together a narrative from what I was hearing in these podcasts, basically.
Awesome story, Richard. I'm loving it. Thank you for sharing. It's funny how, that really started from a lack of inspiration, right? You're at film school and you're like, fuck this. This is not, and you quite rightly highlight that perhaps it was your own headspace that wasn't quite right. But, surfing in Africa, getting yourself to Afghanistan, going to Alaska, starting a business, like these are all inspired moments, and obviously mixed in with, senses of anxiety. You literally mentioned that, like at points you're anxious about things, and the idea of being on an actual film set sounded stressful. Like that's not so interesting. And we all take these different turns I think it's in our nature in a sense. Like something doesn't look appealing, but someone else that does look appealing, and off you go. And here we are today, and that's such a brilliant story. So you've made 3 films. Can you just for those listening mention the titles of those films and which order did you make them? And perhaps just a little synopsis on what inspired you for each 3, because they're all slightly different to each other, about 30 minutes long. And yeah, so you've used like what looks to me like a montage of imagery, essentially, with then audio over the top. So how do you actually make a film like that? And what goes into the process of creating it? How long does it take to make a 30-minute long film? So yeah, just a bit more flavor in terms of what that process actually looks like and how you came to the results you did.
Sure. So that project that I was sort of leading to discussing how that came about, that was the first one, which is called Hard Money. And it's basically like all the projects, none of them really deal with Bitcoin directly at all. They're more sort of exploring these issues that are sort of peripheral to Bitcoin, but really critical to understanding Bitcoin. And perhaps the best way to sum it up is to say it's an attempt to highlight a problem, a really important problem that you may not have known you had, and then lead you to the edge of the rabbit hole where, okay, Bitcoin actually solves this problem if you're willing and open to understand it. So Hard Money is really a sort of reflection or investigation into inflation, which sounds like a boring topic, but I sort of find it endlessly fascinating. And it was this revelation to me to learn how inflation as a mechanism actually works, and why, and that I'd sort of been blindsided or tricked, even though I'd had quite a long and involved history of studying economics, that I didn't understand inflation. I didn't understand that the main cause of inflation was an increase in the money supply. I'd sort of been taught that, if there's inflation, it means that the economy is overheating, or there's some supply chain problem, or I'd been taught that it was a problem, some kind of inherent problem with the economy, but it was never broached the fact that it could be a monetary issue, which I think in fact is the main issue. So Hard Money, the main thesis is just the fact that central banks in sort of hand in hand with governments use inflation as a mechanism to sort of to confiscate wealth, without having to do it directly via taxation. It's basically another funding mechanism for the growth of government. And you may or may not agree with that, but at least it's good to be aware of how the mechanism works. And then the second project I did is called Anatomy of the State. And so it's, I guess, builds on that concept, but it's this sort of exploration of anarcho-capitalism, which we started talking about before. Anatomy of the State is a book by Murray Rothbard. It's only a very short book. You can read it in a day, but
I just finished it.
It was actually a real... Yeah. Oh, excellent. Yeah, it's one of those books that it was a revelation to me when I read it, because it's just something so simple that I'd never thought about before. It just discusses the nature of government. We touched earlier on this idea of the monopoly on violence. And so but it's quite scathing in its analysis of the institution of the state and what it represents. So that film is basically an introduction to libertarian theory, but the word, I think, these days, Rothbard would have called himself a libertarian, but these days I don't even know that libertarian. It's almost more extreme than libertarianism. Like, I think these days, not that I really know, but if you look at some of the libertarian parties that are out there, and I've read a couple of books, or at least tried to read them, kind of modern introductions to libertarianism, and it seems more like this. It's just like a classic liberalism, like small, that they're sort of advocating limited government. Like, yes, there's a place for government. We need some institution that sort of basically runs the justice system and enforces the law. Whereas Rothbard is very radical in saying that, any kind of government is kind of evil, basically, and doesn't fit within his system. So, yeah, reading Rothbard has been quite a powerful experience for me. So this film was an attempt to sort of, I guess, express some of those ideas, put my own interpretation on it. I mean, it's quite a true sort of, it sticks to Rothbard's text quite closely, but every now and then it veers off and adds a few sections in that where it tried to tie in some economics, and we don't talk about Bitcoin directly, but and then the third and most recent project I've done is called Petrodollars. And so it's once again, it's not really about Bitcoin, but it's about the way the United States has kind of, in the last 30 or 40 years, extended its hegemony over the global financial system through a deal that it did with Saudi Arabia, where there was a deal done between the US and Saudi Arabia, where all the oil sold by Saudi Arabia and OPEC and the oil producing nations had to be priced in dollars, US dollars only, that you couldn't buy oil for any other currency, and that all that money was then subsequently funneled back into the purchase of US treasuries. And this system basically prolonged the US dollar hegemony for decades past, when it may have come unstuck. It sort of talks a bit, we start off with post-World War II, the Bretton Woods Conference, and the construction of this modern financial system, and there's a bit of history about that. And then, it goes through the Vietnam War and things that happened in the US and globally, right up to the present day. So that is, I suppose, more of a realist sort of piece, in that most of the footage in that film is real footage from events and things that happened, and which was sort of something different to the previous projects, which were quite abstract. And now to talk a bit about how the films are made, there were because those first two projects were dealing with these themes that are a little bit esoteric. It was sometimes hard to find the footage that would work with those themes and be relevant. Whereas Petrodollars was great because I came across so much incredible old footage of all these events.
Politicians shaking hands and all sorts of stuff. I remember, yeah.
And I'd sort of, I picked the project sort of for that reason, because there was a big gap where I really didn't have a project in the works for a while. But then when I read, it's Petrodollars, it's based on an article by Alex Gladstein in Bitcoin magazine. And when I read that, it instantly sort of light bulb went off that this would be perfect as a film piece. So, but yeah, the process of making the films is quite simple in that it's all done in front of the computer. I don't talk to anyone. I don't do anything aside from assemble material I find online. So even all the narration or the interviews or all of that, I've never sat down with someone and recorded anything. It's always something that I've already listened to and found, and it's just me piecing together things that are already out there, usually from podcasts. All the narration, where there is a narrator in all the films, is always Guy Swan reading something on his podcast, and then it's interspersed with clips from interviews with people that I've found, in other Bitcoin podcasts. So certainly going back to Hard Money, the first project I did where I sort of established this kind of method, I sort of built up this narrative in audio format with these podcasts. And then it was kind of about, well, how do I actually set something visual to this? And I'd kind of somewhere come across a lot of these old animations on trawling through YouTube. They're from the 50s and 60s. These series of American animations, and it's interesting how some of them are quite pertinent in that they're about money, and some of these political themes we've talked about, like freedom and so I found a lot of this interesting old footage that I was able to cut in, and it just seemed to work. And then I also came across all these old cartoons that were Soviet cartoons that had been made in Russia, and a lot of them were actually anti-American propaganda, basically, and they're really quite artistic and amazing stuff. And so I was able to some of it I was able to cut in because the points they were making were actually quite interesting, and then other stuff I was able to repurpose the footage to sort of tell the story that I wanted to tell. So a lot of the visual content from the first couple of those first two projects comes from all these old animations that I've found. And so with all the films, I don't claim any kind of copyright over them. I've never tried to monetize the projects or do anything other than it's just a video I'm releasing online. Because having, to a certain extent, been through that process on some other projects when I was doing those travel documentaries, and the process you'd have to go through to license, say, a piece of music, or for example, if I wanted to get a 20-second clip from the news channel and get the ability to use that, like that, the time and expense involved in that, it makes the whole thing just a pain. And you spend all your time, instead of being creative, you're just chasing your tail doing this sort of administrative work. So with these projects, that very early on, I just decided I'm not going to do any of that. I don't care. I'm not going to ask permission. I'm just ripping everything from YouTube. I'm ripping everything from these podcasts, and I'm just going to put it out there and see what happens. I did try and get, once I'd actually put the first one together, I did reach out to a lot of people in Bitcoin who either I literally put their voice in the thing, or whoever had the podcast that I took it from. And of course, none of them knew who I was. I didn't even have a Twitter account at that point. But most people got back to me and were quite, everyone who did get back to me was very supportive and encouraging. Wow. And so it sort of went from there, that I released that online, and it had quite a good reception, and sort of, I didn't really expect it. And, one thing led to another, and here we are. And having done 3 of these, it's just been such a nice process to have been able to do this work that I enjoy so much. And I honestly didn't expect the feedback that I've had, that people have actually found these things entertaining and useful in trying to teach people about Bitcoin.
It's wonderful. There's no doubt that, I got value from them. It's a really interesting niche to be looking at, like quite to the problem you identified initially, which is there's some great podcasts out there, there's some great writers out there, and you're like, well, hang on, I know how to make films. And we did briefly talk through just a concept I've seen work very well in other startup areas around 1 minute long viral video. And it'd be awesome to see yourself create more content in that kind of time range and see how that goes online. Like just on your Twitter profile, you have a 2-minute long video that you've got pinned to the profile, which I watched just before our conversation today. And I think it's Jeff Booth who you have talking over some imagery. It's really powerful. And what I'm interested in really is Bitcoin adoption. And so any way of helping people learn about it or get their attention is valuable. And what you're creating here is exactly that kind of tool. And you already really mentioned it, which is they might be three quite separate subjects, hard money through to the state, through to the petrodollar, but they all provide context to the discussion, which is, what the fuck is our money? Why are we using it? Why do we need potentially something different? How does Bitcoin solve that problem? And there'll be lots of different, in a sense, ingredients to that pile for different people. And I do just think what you've been creating is a big part of that. So I look forward to what other things you might come up with, and on which point I should ask. So what does the future have in store then, Richard? I mean, what have you got cooking? Is there anything in the pipeline, or what are your plans for the next few months?
There's actually not. And that's kind of by design. I just thought I needed to just take a bit of a break from this specific line of type of work, just temporarily. And that was partly, I mentioned early on that I've just, I've not been doubting myself, but, I just think the time is right. I've been going so hard at this for so many years, and well, for 3 years now, this has sort of been my main focus. And as I said, I was so sure of myself that I was right. I was right about Bitcoin, and I think I still am. And I was right about this sort of political theory and this version of the world, and I was on Twitter all the time, and I was getting angry, and I just kind of, I think I've burnt out a little bit. And the first of all is as simple as that, is that I think it's probably one of my New Year's resolutions was just to spend less time on my computer and my phone.
Yeah.
And I just wanted to sort of, like, I've been so engaged in the Bitcoin community for these years that I think, just the intensity of that in an emotional sense, I sort of don't think I could have sustained that. And I also found myself falling into this trap that I realize is a bad one of the sort of popularity contest of Twitter, of like, or my follow account, or is my tweet getting likes, and that was taking up a lot of my headspace. And I realized that that's kind of it's just, there's nothing to be gained by focusing on that. Certainly not for me. I think it's a very valid thing, in that if you're trying to build an audience and potentially make a career out of this industry, I think it's valid. And I can't be critical of Twitter, because it's what's given me the opportunities that I've had, and that's how I've been able to find an audience for this work. But there was that element, and the fact that I would just, especially with everything that's happened in the world in the last 2 years, I would just get too angry. I would get on Twitter in the morning and I'd read 5 or 6 things, and my blood would boil. And I just think there's possibly a benefit in just stepping away a little bit. And to give another example, I recently listened to the series on Robert Breedlove's What is Money show with a guy called Jeff Snyder. And it's fascinating. I've listened to some of his stuff before. And he's an expert in the Eurodollar system. Mm-hmm. And so his main thesis is basically that he's not anti-Bitcoin. He's not a Bitcoiner, but nor is he an anti-Bitcoin necessarily. But he basically says that the whole idea of the central bank creating money is a bit of a myth, because he doesn't believe that the specific mechanism that the central bank goes through in the way that it buys treasuries and then creates these bank reserves that it sends out into the system, he actually doesn't think that that effectively makes any difference to the money supply, because the commercial banking system that sits underneath that don't really consider these bank reserves as money or as a type of collateral that would actually make a change to the way they operate, and that there's like this, the liquidity, the central bank is completely impotent to get liquidity into the places where it actually needs. And he also talks about the fact that, I just spent the last 4 months on this project about the petrodollar system and how important that was, and how, the US is this evil empire, and that their hegemony of the money system has created all these problems. And he sort of says, it was almost like in a throwaway line, that the petrodollar system is almost irrelevant compared to the eurodollar system, which is this shadow banking system run completely by this network of international commercial banks that have built up a monetary system with these US dollars that they've sort of created from nowhere, that has what the central banks do have no relevance to them. And he said that that's the system that actually governs global finance. Now, he may be right and he may be wrong, but it's just an example of me being like, if he is right, then a lot of the stuff Bitcoiners are saying certainly about central banking is, we maybe need to just stop and kind of reflect a bit on this. And I think part of the problem is that the system is so complex, but in terms of the way central banking works and then the way commercial banking works, that I certainly don't feel confident, even after all these years, to say that I actually understand. I really understand how the system works. I don't think I do. Like they say don't trust, verify. Well, I've sort of been trusting these people to explain to me how the whole system works, because I just can't hope to get in there and grasp it myself. And I just think, and the same with I won't harp on that, but that's just one example. And then when it comes to the political theory, my most recent kind of interest and rabbit hole has been one of self-sufficiency, and going down this path of growing my own food, and husbanding my own animals, and kind of living off the land a little bit more. And that's led me to explore certain sort of other ways that one might organize a society that have a more communal aspect. And it's just once again made me reflect. Look, I think I'm still confident in my opinions, but look, maybe I just need time to reflect on all this a bit more. And yeah, so my goal this year is just to spend less time on the computer. I don't know that I'm going to do any film projects, and just kind of, yeah, I think with a few months of just sort of getting my head together, I might come back with a clearer mind and different focus, and maybe find a new project.
Well, Richard, thank you for sharing that. I mean, there's no doubt that day-to-day life takes its toll. And yeah, I mean, I can speak from personal experience, like Twitter can be an incredibly addictive tool that is actually very unhelpful, because you end up getting anxious about something you might have said, or someone attacks you about something, and it can be unhelpful. And so to at least recognize when one is not feeling how they would like to, etc., then that's the first step, isn't it? Okay, well, how can I change what I do every day? And as you mentioned, less time on the laptop and avoiding your phone, and these are like really easy, actionable steps that I'm sure have made a difference. Equally, to be fair, you have been on an extraordinary creative streak, right? There's no one can keep up that level of performance for like a sustained period of time. Everyone needs to look after themselves, take a breath. And yeah, I mean, lastly, to your comments about like worldview, the the speed that my worldview has changed in 24 months is crazy. And a lot of that's around really starting to look at what is going on and how perhaps one's been lied to, perhaps one's been manipulated and conditioned for a long, long time to think that, you know, for example, reading Anatomy of the State, it's pretty blunt. And you go, oh, but isn't the government good? You know, that's what we've been taught our whole life, you know, through history lessons in class and through the messaging of the entire setup. So it's confronting on its own. You know, you're like, whoa, this is really abrasive in a sense. And, you know, you talk to your sibling and they're like, you fucking lost the plot, mate. Or whatever the case might be. And they've basically had the same life as you, right? Similar school and similar age and whatever, same parents. And then you have these completely different worldviews. You're like, how did we end up at this point? And so, yeah, like just taking a breath and taking a break is a great shout. Well, Richard, look, an hour and a half has flown by. Thank you so much for sharing all of that with me. I look forward to getting to know you better over the months and years to come. And hopefully we'll see each other at the Bitcoin Bush Bash whenever that happens again. Yeah, I mean, even if you're not going to be on Twitter, is that the best place for people to get hold of you? If anyone's looking to, well, first of all, buy your new product, or equally get in touch about your films or whatever, where would people be able to reach you?
Twitter's still the best place. I just, you know, I'm still on there. Just as you mentioned, just about some conscious strategies just to reduce some of the negative elements of it. Yeah, and it's just something as simple as getting rid of the app on the phone, and I check it once every couple of days, just on my computer. That's the best way. rjames_BTC. On my Twitter profile, there's a link to the websites with all my my films where you can go watch them, and you know, you can get in touch with me that way. So that's still the best spot. Thanks, still Richard. There. I don't think I could burn Twitter completely.
No, you can't, because it's too much fun in a sense.
Exactly. I'll be back.
The subject you touched on at the very end there, the euro dollar, that needs exploring. But it's a conversation for another time. So perhaps if you do go down that rabbit hole, then we get together again and have another conversation.
Absolutely.
But yeah, for now, thank you so much for your time.
Oh, thanks so much for having me, Jake. It's been such a great conversation. Thanks for your thoughtful questions and responses. I've really enjoyed it.
Pleasure. Cheers, Richard.